to the appropriations.
Okay. So today, I will fill you in on a few things. The House has voted out the child care bill with a combination of corporate and personal income tax. The money chairs have been meeting. We've told them that we would not accept that if you want to do a broad-based benefit like paid family leave, then a broad-based tax like Income Works. This is a limited benefit. It benefits employers and employees, and that's where the Senate was. Budget discussions are on hold at the moment as this gets worked out. So just give you a progress report. That's where we're hanging.
So the Senate is still sticking to the date.
We are still sticking. Let's see, there is on today S100, we don't have it, and the goal of having it on is I don't want it. They put a few utility PUC things on the housing bill as it came back about shut-off notices, and I thought we'd take a look at it, and then if we really want it in here, we can ask for it, but I don't want to kill that bill because we run out of time.
There's also some language about moving wires.
Yes, there's some language about utility infrastructure in there. You know, I don't want to take a chance with the bill. We'll take a look at it. If you feel we need to work on it, we'll ask to take it in. But if we don't, I don't want to delay it a day going through the referral process. So that's on. And we do need to get all our governors' confirmations out. So I need, if you have that list by the end of the day, then I can start crossing out. Okay, before I knew all of this good stuff was coming, the S94, the Barry chip bill, has come back to us well decorated. I'm not sure if we're gonna try and get S94 out. I've gotta see what its chances are, or if we're gonna take the stuff we think is important and stick it on miscellaneous tax. But we're gonna see what's on there before we make that decision, and then I'll see.
That's very.
Yeah, but
Just for every request or is it?
no. This is their version of the Christmas tree. They did to Barry what we usually do to tax. So anyway, but we're gonna do 480. That's the property valuation and reappraisal bill. Abby's here. She's been over it with us.
Squeeze it.
I don't know. I was told this wasn't a must have to get it out. I like to clear my boards, so I'm gonna try. We will have 3 days during the veto session, which we will probably twiddle our thumbs while we wait for things to pass back and forth, and we might be able to get it out then, if not this week, but so Abby, can you give us like the 20,000? Because we went through this in detail. Basically, the House has said they are going to go, the state's going to be doing the reappraisal. The Senate has said, well, we have this big study, but pending the study telling us something we don't think it will, we intend to go to the state doing the appraisals. You know, the league is a little anxious about this. So we're gonna take testimony and see where it goes. All right,
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. That is correct. The House did pass out a version that would have shifted the reappraisal system to the state in 2026, so it was delayed. It would have put that into statute. The House version did also require a study from the Department of Taxes, both on moving to a statewide reappraisal system and also looking at categorizing or classifying properties in a different way from the current very sort of more simplistic system where it's homestead versus not homestead, and there aren't statutory sort of categories or types of properties, and there are often policy questions about how do you tax or look at, even get data on different property types. So both from a tax perspective, but also there are questions about housing data as well. There was also an important shift in what triggers a reappraisal order, which would have taken effect retroactive to last year's grand list.
CLA.
So that was repealing the CLA as a trigger for a reappraisal order. And your Senate Government Operations Committee kept that repeal of the CLA as a trigger. They changed some of the report requirements. They expanded some of them to get more housing type data for different property types. The Senate Government Operations Committee also did remove the statutory change to shift to statewide reappraisals. So as you said, Madam Chair, that's no longer in the bill. It would wait until that version of the bill would wait until the study has come back in 2024. So right before the 25 session, there would be a full report from the Department of Taxes. They also required made it clear that stakeholder involvement was required. So those are really the big grant schemes, the big, I don't know if that's the right word, but the large, like 100-foot perspective on this bill. Also to note, while the CLA trigger was repealed in both versions, the Senate Government Operations Committee added a new trigger for reappraisals, which would be a municipality having to reappraise every 6 years. But there was discretion given to PDNR to decide which municipalities would be subject to that and when. And part of the report back due at the end of 2024 was to have a schedule for phasing in municipalities. So not every single municipality that hasn't reappraised in 6 years having to reappraise at the same time.
Okay, but if the state's doing it, then the state would have to do it for that municipality every 6 years. I'm assuming the reason that municipalities are concerned is that reappraisals are expensive. And so if their CLA is not off, they don't have to. To do one is expensive, and the smaller the town per capita, the more expensive. The other problem we're having is because of the boom in housing prices, really an unprecedented. It's almost like the majority of towns have tripped the CLA trigger and are being required to do an appraisal. There are not enough appraisers out there, so we have this backlog of appraisals. There is an issue with especially small towns having, it be worth an appraiser's while to do that. If I do a big town, I got to do 3 other small towns. There's always a certain amount of grief with reappraisal. So, they're a private business. They can go and they can charge. And so we've got backlog. And it's not really the town's fault that they can't reappraise because they can't get an appraiser. So I think that's one of the problems they're trying to solve. But I'm not sure. Okay, any questions for Abby at this point? Okay, I promised the tax department, since we sat and listened through all these studies they were being assigned, then I would give them equal time to tell us Not that we ever ask staff or departments to do things. You know how they're gonna have the staff and timing to do it, so.
Yes,
The
well,
floor is yours.
yeah, well, Rebecca Samroff, Deputy Commissioner, Vermont Department of Taxes, and I do appreciate that question. It's not often that we're seeking giant, multi-year studies to work on, but I think in this case, especially the journey of H480 through both chambers, we're really happy where the bill is now, as passed by Senate Gov Ops. I'd just like, for some context, which I think you were just, doing a great job of articulating, H480 kind of came out of the House hearing a lot about municipalities feeling pressure to reappraise in response to Vermont's red hot real estate market, CLA changes, et cetera, and really beginning to ask them, I think, important questions about the stability and sustainability of our current reappraisal process. They had a big action in response to that, but the bill has changed significantly since it left the House. I'll say that I'm still hearing a lot of strong concerns from the community about this bill and stakeholders, and a lot of the concerns seem to be with that House passed version. So I think we might hear some of that today from stakeholders. I just want to help clarify, where we're at today.
Is it the every 5 years and the state? There's the state taking over the every 5 years. Is that?
I think state takeover was probably like the biggest concern, and then there was a lot of structure put into the House bill around what that would look like, the office that would be created in PDR, the budget for that office. Many of very valid concerns and questions, I think, raised about that, and I'll say that the tax department had many of those concerns and questions as well coming out of that. So, but we worked really closely with your colleagues across the hall to, I think, right-size this to be like a pretty substantial piece of learning for the tax department to go away and come back with in 18 months. And there's a report back period at the, before the next session in December, where I think we'll have an opportunity to, highlight our progress towards all these deliverables, but also, probably recommend some changes like based on our learning for what's in the bill at that point too. So it's really, I like the format of having the time that these big questions deserve to do our due diligence. There's also some funding for hiring a national.
In 25?
The funding would be right away.
No, when your report's due in 25.
One deliverable is due December of 2023, so right before you all reconvene for the next
But that's
session.
also after at least the Senate's ability to introduce bills is what clicked that with me.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, that is just a progress report date, and then the final report is due December of 2024. I'm distracted now. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so that is, this is 23. 24 would be the next legislation.
Right.
Okay, so then there would be time to put in a bill. And nothing is going to happen until this study comes back. But I mean, in general, this study comes back. It'll come back to a new legislature that will then have time to develop a bill. And okay, that's good. That's not helping the present CL.
Well, yeah, so there are, I think you're setting me up perfectly for just what I was hoping to do, which is like, quickly, very plain language from the way I understand it, which is in plain language. I just go through like what this bill is still doing tangibly and what it's not doing anymore. So, as we just covered, the bill no longer takes steps to implement a state taking over the responsibilities to contract for or do the reappraisal work ourselves. Which means no more office, no more positions or funding at the tax department for that. That was our big ask, was to pull out that implementation, because we want to learn about, if we can recommend taking that over.
Why? You're
much less-
prejudging the study if
Right.
you've already determined what you're going to do.
Right, and what impact on our municipal stakeholders, property owners, all that stuff. So we are asked to study the question, present a plan of what it could look like for that state takeover. This includes also like what an appeals process would look like in a
in a centralized system. But, we have other questions that we want to answer too. Like the real crux of this curiosity was how do we introduce predictability and economies of scale into this reappraisal landscape? Because I think you'll hear from further testimonies today, we have a real supply demand issue, as you just articulated, and towns don't have access to myriad reappraisal firms to do the work, and also some towns are really small and their smaller grant lists aren't that appealing for a reappraisal firm to work on. So there's definitely having a predictable schedule where you could contract out into the future, and also having potentially bigger groupings of
But if the
reappraisal
state's gonna
properties.
do what, you won't have to, but
Well, I should say that this has always been conceived as the state would either take over the contracting for the reappraisals, which means working with the exact same reappraisal firms out there, but just centralizing the contracting. Or in the bill, there's an option for the state to take this on with, state employee FTEs. I think, having not researched this, I agree with the skepticism that we'd be able to staff up to just create the best reappraisal firm in the state. So I think,
and what would that happen to the other?
lean towards contracting with the existing population is my strong suspicion there. But
Really? Yeah.
so there's the study, right? And the study actually has a pretty tangible piece, which is designing an initial reappraisal schedule. So there are, and I guess that gets into the pieces that the bill actually does do tangibly. One is that it does end reappraisal orders based on CLA alone. So there's still other reasons to trigger a reappraisal, like the coefficient of dispersion, which is a measure of inequity within a town's grand list, much more concerning from an equity perspective. Luckily, the CLA is still out there doing its job to equalize towns' contributions into the ed fund across the state. That doesn't mean that it needs to be used as a trigger for reappraisal.
Okay.
So that would end.
But you still get the CLA impact on your tax rate, right?
Yes,
Okay, so
which is a good thing.
you don't have to, but it's going to cost you more if you don't.
The CLA actually works to make sure that the age of your, it's kind of like a proxy of reappraising regularly. It's if your grand list is way off from fair market value, the CLA will bring it back up. So it's doing its job. It's doing its job correctly. It'll continue doing that. Whether this bill passes or not. But if this bill were to become law, then towns would no longer be ordered to reappraise based on where their CLA is at. But the other thing the bill does, as Abby just described, is it commences a 6-year reappraisal cycle. And that's kind of you wouldn't want to take away the CLA trigger, but then have no backstop for a super aging grand list. So having a reoccurring cycle into the future will, protect towns' grand lists for getting way out of date. And so that's kind of the balance it tries to strike here. And I think, probably our biggest, most important study deliverable is the recommended schedule of when towns should be how to start this, how to move from today's process of, reappraisal orders and towns lining up with the limited supply of existing contractors, queuing up years in advance, to a system that smoothly rolls every 6 years. And I think that'll be a very interesting question, logic puzzle at the department. I can tell you that, if we end up getting assigned this work, I think the first couple of years of that reappraisal cycle will be heavily informed by what's going on the ground, who's currently lined up with the contractor, getting ready to reappraise in 2027. And then we'll, recommend I think probably a number of different schedules, one, what would it look like if we did it county by county? What would it look like if we did it based on, geography
And I
or not
think,
geography?
if it hasn't been asked already.
Yeah.
This committee will probably ask for a cost estimate
That is absolutely in the report too.
Okay, good.
We're asked for a lot of details on costs, and that's
You to
specific.
the municipalities.
And the department for various scenarios. And there's a lot of money out there in the system now for reappraisal work too. So it'll all be wrapped up in that. So I think the 6-year cycle, the end of the CLA triggered reappraisals, and then a lot of homework for the tax department are the 3 main things that this bill is still doing. I just want to say before, one small thing. The only thing that we asked to be removed from the GovOps version that wasn't was they added language to extend PBR's training requirements for hired municipal assessing officials. They asked for those to be extended to elected listers. And that's something that we were just a little uncomfortable about because we don't know how we would enforce that, you know, if like an elected official is not taking the free online PBR courses, like we can't like unelect them. Like I don't.
I mean, yeah, it's like.
So we absolutely encourage all elected officials to take these courses. They're free, they're available. I think it like really helps their
They
work.
generally work as volunteers, so you can't dock their pay if they don't.
Get fired for cutting questions.
Can't fund,
Right.
yeah.
So that's the only piece that, you know, it's not like, I think if the decision was between like, you know, keeping the bill to tinker with that or, you know, letting us start that work, I would vastly prefer just getting started on this. But that was a piece that, you know, just felt a little challenging for us to figure out where our teeth would be. Also, just like want to say that as we work through this topic with other committees, I've heard such good questions from both committee members, from stakeholders. I'm sure you'll hear from many of them today. Knowing this group, I'm anticipating many more great questions on this topic, but I think many of these are like squarely in the realm of why we wanted 18 months to do research and report back. So there's just like a lot of great material that we don't have answers on yet, and we're really looking forward to do. So yeah, I guess I'll just say that like I know this isn't a must-pass bill, but a lot of folks have done a lot of work on this bill so far, and we have a lot of homework in front of us. And you know, I'm eager to get started on it, and would just as rather pass and let us, you know, come back to you in our first report back period with any concerns that, you know, are raised in that first study period, and then we'll have a whole nother year for a second study period, and that would be my recommendation.
Okay, well, we will try and get that out of here. Any questions? I'm not seeing any, so thank you.
Great, I'll hang around if stuff comes up.
Yeah, I would. Okay, Karen Horn is here.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I don't think I'll take up a lot of your time. We were very concerned about the bill as it came over from the House because it did presuppose that there would be a statewide reappraisal system before the studies were completed. So I do think that the way that the Senate Government Operations Committee has sort of moved things around, there is going to be a pretty comprehensive study before any decision is made that we need to move to a state reappraisal system. So that was one of our biggest concerns. We had initially, and it's almost funny to think about now, but we had initially visited with the House Ways and Means Committee about the idea of removing the CLA as a trigger for reappraisal and putting towns on a schedule. And the tax department and the League of Cities and Towns came in together with that idea. And then things sort of did what they do in the legislature, which is mushroom. So the piece that we think would be very helpful is to continue forward with the idea that the CLA is not going to be the trigger, and that you would put towns on a schedule, which I believe in this bill is every 6 years you would reappraise, and that you would get that study started of the whole system.
So the league at this point can live with this bill.
We're okay with it the way it is written right now, yes.
Okay. All right, any questions for Karen? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm right.
Oh, you have a question.
So leave things as they are, and there were greater despair. There were, the last couple of years, values have gone up for alacrity than one would expect. Would PDR simply be doing their year, continue to do their year after year
Yeah,
equalization
they
study?
would do the equalization study, it would be a question better for Rebecca. And they would continue to send out orders for towns to reappraise, orders that can't be filled right now because the appraisers aren't there.
So you've got the notice, you're getting the adjustment to your rate,
Yeah.
but right now, many towns just can't get an appraiser
You
to
can't
do
get
an
an
appraisal.
appraiser. And so the idea, one of the ideas around this schedule is that you would introduce predictability into the Vermont system, which is what most other states, I mean, there's no other state that has what we have. But that if you're on a regular schedule, then reappraisal firms might be more interested in maybe combining with a few municipalities that are all due in the same year, and they would know what was coming down the pike.
So, okay,
When you have towns that don't hire professional appraisers and have listers do it, how's that working? Where is it?
I think there's very few of those anymore. Again, Rebecca may know better, but most towns hire an appraisal.
Now just imagine that you're down in a situation where there's nobody to hire.
Right.
And so had any towns elected to say, well, we need to reappraise, and so therefore our listers will do it, and we'll give them, I see it gives them, I think, if I remember the bill correctly, it gives them a year to take training of some kind.
Yeah, I don't know of any town that has, well, first of all, listers are a extinct breed also, pretty much, but I don't know of any town, that is, we're down to one in one town, that is relying on the listers to do the appraisal. The one thing that we have been concerned about also with the study is that with the appeals, we do think that when property owners appeal, the first level of appeal should remain at the local level, like the circumstances there. But I think that that's one of the issues that the study would take a look at. But I don't know of a town that has said, okay, listers, go ahead and reappraise. Some towns are several years out in terms of having a contract.
Well, one of the things that also goes to the issue of listing is where you have somebody who appeals their appraisal or their listing. And it may be because of some change that's occurred since the last appraisal. You have a lay board of civil authority that views it. And I assume that the appeal is to the valuation folks, is that right?
Well, the first appeal is to the Board of Civil Authority.
Right,
You can go to the Board of Civil Authority, and then I think you can go either to the state board or you can go to court.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I think you have a choice.
In terms of
at
the
that point.
appeal to the Board of Civil Authority, are you getting any issues there that essentially might say that this is a board that's not qualified to judge these valuation changes, and that ought to be done by an appraiser as well?
I'm sure those conversations are out there. I've not heard them. I haven't heard anybody speak specifically to us about them, but you're right. It is a lay board, but it's also the people on the ground that see the situation. And Rebecca may have said before I came in, but there are towns that haven't appraised and reappraised in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so the hike is going to be pretty substantial. And you heard that actually.
Yeah.
From stuff.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you. We're going on to Lisa Wright. Lisa is on the big screen. Welcome, Lisa, and just introduce yourself for the record and who you represent.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you can hear me okay. I would have preferred to be there in person. It just feels much more natural to have a conversation. But once I introduce myself, you will understand why I didn't have time to take a day in Montpelier today. I am president of the Vermont Assessors and Listers Association. I am chair of the Board of Listers in the town of West Rutland. So I can tell you right out of the box that listers are definitely not extinct yet. I am also contract assessor for 5 other towns in Rutland County. I do bank appraisals as well as town tax assessment, and I have done townwide reappraisals. I'm not currently doing that with 6 towns as their ongoing assessor. So assessor and lister respectively. I've been in the business for about 20 years. My dad, Steve Wright, was an appraiser before me, and I, came up in my training, with him as an expert in the field for sure. So I'm speaking for VALA today, and we'll try to distinguish if I'm giving answers from Lisa Wright's opinion versus the opinion of VALA. But I have provided you our position statements, which we have agreed on by the VALA executive board or full board, as well as our legislative committee on the point-by-point response that Government Ops asked us to provide to them. So we've put a lot of work into this, and I just have to say before I start that it's interesting some of the commentary and testimony that you're getting from people that are not in this field and have never worked in this field. And I'm hearing a lot of misinformation that you're getting. What is common threads you're going to hear among my testimony, that of the letter Todd LeBlanc is submitted, that of Ed Clodfelter, who's going to speak later, as well as Christopher Landon, is a perspective from people who are actually doing this work. And I think you'll find that it's the missing piece that you need here is an understanding of how we actually do our work. I've submitted a letter with a summary of my testimony. So as far as where VALA stands with H480, we are somewhat pleased and relieved that the bill has evolved away from creating a state reappraisal office program for the moment. However, we do differ from VLCT's opinion in that we remain concerned that the study planned for the year ahead will bring us right back to that point. We sincerely hope that this will be a true study of the feasibility of this project and not be a process of confirming what the original bill intended from the start. One of my concerns is a study being done by a consulting firm familiar with constructing statewide appraisal programs. What are the chances they're going to give you any sales pitch other than constructing exactly that? And I think this whole process needs a lot more consideration than even the 18-month study that is being considered. I think that's just warranted. So VALA also remains concerned about the lack of understanding in the bill of the lead time required in implementing some of these changes and unintended consequences that may be the result of this lack of understanding. And not to be unduly negative about PBR, they've been a tremendous support to listers and assessors throughout the state of Vermont. But a case in point is the VT-PI Grand List program. We have a crisis right now in 2023 with launching our preliminary grand list because of this program and because of the state and the firm that was hired to do this underestimating all of the work that needed to go in and underestimating the lead time. So I hate to see another situation like that making our jobs more difficult. At this point, the delays caused by that VT-PI program, the new grand list program, will likely require extensions to filing the grand list in many, many towns throughout Vermont. And I think you will understand the financial implications if all towns are delayed in this, which will in turn delay tax bills going out and then will in turn delay tax revenue being received. And I'd just like to, I'm happy to answer questions. I would like to just close with a couple of comments, which is in my letter, which is I would like to address the bias that I have heard throughout this process of testifying and interacting with this legislation, that listers are inferior in qualifications and ability to that of assessors. According to testimony today, we may be in fact extinct. Well, I can tell you that we're not, and I think I'm a case in point where I am chair of the listers in one town and a contract assessor in another town. This unfortunate bias demeans many hardworking assessors who happen to be elected listers, and also makes the erroneous assumption that the title of assessor automatically qualifies one to do this work. The fact is, we are all assessors. And the only difference in what we do is that of acting under the authority of a board of listers versus an individual assessor. Further, I'd ask you to consider that a board of several elected listers might have more ability to be impartial than a sole individual. And that board might also have more autonomy to operate in a fair and impartial manner than an assessor who is hired and must report to the select board. So on this topic of consolidation of towns for reappraisal contracts, this is something we need to legislate. There are many of us who are working on doing that right now. I've been working on a proposal to bring my towns, which are all contiguous, so they're similar geographic area. It's very feasible to do that, to bring them under one reappraisal contract. And as you'll hear from testimony from others, there's simply a real supply problem with qualified individuals to do townwide reappraisals. And to answer the question that Senator Brock asked about whether any listers did townwide appraisals, I can tell him from my experience that yes, they have, and they've done that in several towns in Rutland County. So again, misinformation that you may be getting in the legislature about this. And some of those reappraisal projects with that local knowledge combined with due diligence of boots on the ground and proper inspections have resulted in really quality work. Even a reappraisal conducted by an outside firm requires a lot of that local knowledge and a lot of legwork by the listers. So I'm just here to speak up for the hardworking peers that I have among the ranks of VALA and offer our assistance to inform you better about what it is we do and how we could do that better. Happy to answer questions.
Okay, Senator Brock has a question.
One of the things that we hear from some circles is that contracted assessors have education and certification that places them in a different position than elected listers. I believe, if I remember the bill correctly, for listers, there is the possibility of some sort of a training program. I don't know if it's specifically defined, but it's done in less than a year. Do you know how that compares to the training and certification for the contracted assessors?
So we have in other states do have a certified tax assessor program. We have a voluntary program in Vermont, which is fairly robust. It takes a minimum of 3 years to complete it. Part of the reason being that that the program assumes that you're getting some years of experience. You don't just go to school to learn how to be an assessor. You've got to doing the ongoing work at the same time you're getting the abstract training in classes. And it's a similar program where you have to have completed, I'm certified on both levels as a townwide project supervisor for townwide reappraisals, as well as a master property assessor through the state of Vermont program for listers and assessors. So I think the assumption that assessor by title automatically requires that. I've seen assessors throughout Vermont that are attorneys by trade, all kinds of other backgrounds. And some assessors, in fact, are elected. The city of Rutland comes to mind as a prime example. The assessor there is elected and isn't required to have any training to do that job. They're an elected official, just like a lister is. And that said, I know of so many listers who have devoted at very low pay a lot of their time to become fully qualified and go through our training program through VALA and property valuation and review. We'd be happy to conduct a survey perhaps among our VALA members. And I think that I could reasonably say that we have as many highly qualified listers by title as highly qualified assessors.
Okay, Lisa, we've got listers and assessors at the town level. But when you do an appraisal, you hire an appraiser. And you talked about a 3-year volunteer program. I was a realtor. I did market valuations, which we were very clear were not appraisals, but you definitely put a value on a property for the purposes of selling it. My understanding was that to become an appraiser, there was a 3-year apprenticeship. How do you become, what's the difference between, why is an appraiser a different animal than realtors that have been putting a value on property, listers and assessors? What makes appraisers special?
Excellent question. I'm glad you asked. But I want to just ask a clarifying question. When you're saying appraisers versus assessors, now appraisers for lending purposes have to be licensed through the state of Vermont. And I happen to also carry that title. Many assessors do not. I've found that it's valuable for my practice, where to fully understand fair market value, in my opinion, and this is Lisa Wright's opinion, you really have to understand the lending environment, because many properties are purchased, more properties are purchased with lending considerations than outright cash. So you have to understand both sides of the fence. But that said, so the training program is similar. You're in both cases, you're learning how to evaluate property, to classify it and compare it to similar properties. You're learning about the 3 approaches to value. So it's a kind of a parallel track, if you will, to be a certified tax assessor, as some states have it, and be a licensed fee appraiser for lending purposes. In fact, some of the classes I have substituted for one certification for the other, because they are, appraising is appraising. It requires the same understanding of highest and best use, understanding of analysis to develop a defensible value. The only difference is typically with mass appraisal, with tax assessment appraisal, you are working with a model where you're doing it as a mass appraisal. The trick is, when you do a mass appraisal, you're working with averages and what is average and typical. And you have to have the skills to deal with those properties that don't fit nice and tidily in the mold. Does that help?
That helps. Okay, committee, any questions? All right, Lisa, if the state went to doing the appraisals in-house, I'm got some concern about the impact on appraisers. If we remove that large volume of business, does Vala have any concerns that it might, if we contracted out with appraisers, that's probably one thing, but if we decided to do that in-house, is that something that would concern? I don't want to find out you can't get an appraisal because there's only 2 appraisers left in the state.
Well, it won't affect bank appraisers. Our concern with the state taking that over, if you will, is more of a conflict of interest. And I think that's pretty significant. We have a very fair process of tax valuation and a very fair process of tax appeal, which is easy for any taxpayer to enter that process of appeal. And if you make it more bureaucratic at the state level, you are going to block access to people of lesser means to that process. You're also going to make the state effectively the fox guarding the hen house, if you will, where the same agency that is charged with judging the quality of a townwide reappraisal, of doing our equalization study, and conducting appeals at the PBR level, at the state level of tax appeal, is also going to be contracting appraisal contractors. How does that not do away with some separation of powers and some autonomy that represent checks and balances? I think we have a system that is not so broken in Vermont, and in fact works very well. I've had taxpayers come to tax appeal that came from other states and said, wow, this is so personable and non-intimidating versus what I went through in Connecticut or Massachusetts, where I couldn't even talk to a person to get a tax appeal. I don't think that Vermont needs to lose that, and I don't think it'll serve us well.
Okay. Committee, any other questions? Senator McCormick.
The thumbnail, it sounds to me like you're really arguing against the entire bill. It's not that you want to change it in the bill. You would rather we not pass this bill at all.
Well, we have highlighted some items of the bill which we support, a regular schedule for reappraisals, certainly more training and education in general for people doing this work is something we've supported all along. I mean, that's one of Vala's primary reasons to exist, is to educate and professionalize our members. So there are some parts of it, but we have grave concerns about the sense that we have that this is a creation of big government and essentially a power grab by the state. I just can't mince words. And I would ask you to consider, when the state has ever taken over a complicated process and made it cheaper, more cost effective. I can't think of a scenario where that has come to play.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And keep watching, keep an eye on us.
Will
We're going
do.
to go on to Christopher Landon. Okay, his mute's off. There he is. Welcome. Just introduce yourself for the record and tell us who you represent.
Hello, my name is Christopher Landon. I have been working in the real estate industry for over 2 decades. And I included an analysis of H480 and submitted it yesterday. I seriously doubt that you've had the opportunity to read it. If you ever get bored and you want to fall asleep, feel free. But to give you a little bit about my background, is I'm a professional member for the IAAO, which is the International Association of Assessing Officers, as well as an instructor. I hold a designation with the Real Estate Educators Association. I am a candidate for 2 designations with the IAAO, and also I am a graduate from the Sauder School of Business, University of British Columbia. And specifically, I studied statistical modeling of real estate markets. So I've had the luxury with that is I also studied tax policy. So the first thing that I'd like to address is when it comes to assessment, we have to be fair and equitable. And it's not just the name of our magazine. The whole thing about being fair and equitable in the first part of my report goes over the process statistically how we show equity. I'm not going to talk about that. I don't want to put you to sleep, but it goes into detail with support. Why do we do what we do? And there was a question earlier on in the bill about inequity within the assessment process. And I've tried to support that, hey, this is our process. This is what we utilize. There are two standards. It's with the IAAO. One is the standard on mass appraisal. The other one is the standard on ratio studies. And when we're looking at making sure that we're fair and equitable, we have ways of doing that. Now, there's a couple of things that I'm just going to mention on the statistics side. Is they mention the coefficient of dispersion, COD, that represents horizontal equity. So, as you move across a market, is everything moving in the same direction? Then the other form of equity is vertical equity, and it uses the price-related differential, and it can be supported with the price-related bias. Both of these are statistical measures that will sit there and say, okay, it's measuring horizontal equity is talking about sayings. So if you and your neighbor and you have the same house, you should be paying the same amount of taxes. Whereas you have the lower end of the market and the upper end of the market, that's vertical equity. And that the people that are on the upper end of the market should be paying their fair share. And statistically, we can go ahead and say with a confidence that that is happening. But the one thing that I want to shift, is there any questions on the statistics side?
I am not seeing any.
Okay. The other part is I hold PVR in high regard. Please accept that. I do not agree with PVR taking over the process of doing reappraisals. And this is the reason why, and I agree with Lisa Wright, that what ends up happening is too much of a concentration of power. In my analysis, I give three alternatives. One that is heavy state influence, another that's heavy local influence, and something that's in between. I have traveled, with my work and training, I've traveled all over the United States, and I've talked to a lot of different assessors because regardless of which state you're in, you're doing the same process. And I've tried to distill that to help with this whole process. Now, you were questioning before about how much is this going to cost? So when we look at a time trigger, I agree with getting rid of the CLA trigger for a time trigger. In New England, all states except for New York and Maine have a 5-year cycle. So they're on a 5-year time trigger. Maine is a 10-year time trigger. New York has no reappraisal trigger. And there's a document that talks about that that I've included in my analysis. But in Lawrence Walters' work with the IAAO Research Committee that was published in 2014, broke down what is it for an assessment office to run. And also in 2016, there was a salary survey that was done. And using those two works, I went ahead and looked at, okay, if we're going to have a time trigger and we're going to look at a new model of some way of doing reappraisals, then, okay, what are we looking at? So in the study, 20.3% of the municipalities that were surveyed actually return results. So New England's included, and this was typical to the other parts, other regions of the United States. What ended up happening is 23.9% respond to doing reappraisals every year. And 69.3% sit there and said that we do reappraisals every 5 years. This was also backed up by another study when it came to automatic value models. They sit there and showed that with AVMs, traditionally are on an annual basis for reappraisals, and that not AVMs or more traditional CAMA-based or computer-assisted mass appraisal systems are on a 5-year cycle, and that was for with this study was about 75% of respondents. The important thing to sit there and to when we throw out, okay, we're going to reappraise, is there is the reappraisal and then there is the inspection. And under the standards of mass appraisal, periodic field inspection has to be done, and I've included it within the analysis. And the important thing is that if we're looking at making sure that the inventory is up to date, because that's the only way that we can be fair and equitable is if we're comparing apples to apples. We know what everybody has. And looking at PVR's results from January, there was 3 towns, the last time they reappraised was 2005. There were 14 towns that reappraised in 2006. So that is, how can you be necessarily fair and equitable with that length of time? So with reappraisal triggers, if we're doing a time trigger, which I recommend, and I recommend a 5-year trigger over a 6-year trigger. Traditionally, when you see a 6-year trigger, it's 6 years, but at the 3-year mark, they do a statistical reappraisal. So they're actually reappraising every 3. The one concern that I have with automated valuation models, which would be an annual, is they don't necessarily work as well on rural properties. There was a study that mentioned this, and it was for the fee appraisal industry. And this is would have to be controls and considerations when you created AVM if the state was going to take over the process. AVMs work best for homogeneous neighborhoods, whereas rural properties are heterogeneous, that we they're not necessarily the same. And any questions on that part?
Okay, we're gonna have to start moving along, so.
Okay.
Can I ask a?
Yes,
Yes.
I can't see you, Senator Rom, so you're just gonna have to holler. There you are.
Thanks. So I've actually raised this before, Chris. I think this is fascinating, and I understand talking about equitable in terms of rural. But since you've raised it, if you could also speak to equity across income and race, I feel like that's becoming more of a question. Bigger cities are starting to see huge racial disparities in valuation. And I just felt like Burlington's valuation process exposed a lot of difference if you have the financial and language wherewithal to appeal. So if there's any data you also have about equity from a race perspective and other socioeconomic perspectives, that would also be helpful.
In my analysis, I talk about the one of the studies that Christopher Berry, Dr. Christopher Berry did in Cook County, Illinois. And one of the things that he brought up is that through the appeal process, there's the ability to add in inequities, because theoretically, the people that are on, and I'm just speaking as theoretical, the people that are on higher end properties have more to fight for as far as their taxation, and they have the means to be able to do so. In the analysis that I showed the example, what it does is it breaks down by neighborhood. So when I do a statistical analysis, I'm not looking at people's names. All I have is a number for a neighborhood. And so I'm going to go ahead and use hypothesis testing to make sure that they're equitable.
Okay. Did that help, Senator?
It did. Yeah. I think it's good to start talking about this from that perspective. So I've valued this a lot.
Okay. Senator Brock.
I'm not sure that I understood that. What is hypothesis testing, and what does that tell you that would be relevant to this point?
Okay. So hypothesis testing is, I'm using statistical testing, and there are two main hypothesis testing. Since real estate markets do not follow a bell curve, they're known as non-parametric. It's Mann-Whitney type U and Kruskal-Wallis type H. And what happens is, if I go ahead and take, as an example, neighborhood. So I have 7 neighborhoods. Then I am going to go ahead and do a test. And in that test, my hypothesis is, or my null hypothesis is, that all neighborhoods are being, appraised equally. That's my.
Look, we have lost you. Yeah. I don't, there you go.
My alternative.
Froze.
Am I still there?
You're back.
Oh, sorry.
Here, okay, you kind of,
Okay.
you were really
Yeah,
good
so-
and you froze, so.
All right. Apologize about that. But the using hypothesis testing, it's a way to have statistical certainty that all things are being treated equally. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly.
Okay.
When you say you're doing hypothesis testing, is that, let's say, a comparison of 2 different neighborhoods to see if there's consistency of particular types of property in terms of valuation? Is that what you mean?
Well, what will happen is, let's say that I've got a database and it has all sorts of different variables in it. So it has story height, it has the number of bathrooms, it has the number of bedrooms, has square footage, it has the quality and condition. And what I'm going to do through my process is I am going to compare all of those variables to see if they are being essentially appraised equally. And if they're not, I'm going to make an adjustment to through an adjustment process, double check to validate that I did, and then I'm going to check the next variable. And this is actually a pretty lengthy process.
And I'm assuming that this is a process then that allows you to compare neighborhoods to see if the neighborhoods have been appraised similarly. Is that a fair statement?
Correct.
All right, now, if you have an area such as Vermont, with the exception perhaps of the Burlington area, in which, say, the African-American population is 1.5% to 2%, and there are no concentrated neighborhoods, that wouldn't detect that, would it?
When I look at a database, it doesn't, I'm not looking at race, I'm not looking at name, or I'm not looking at I'm looking at what the neighborhood is. So as long as I treat everybody within that neighborhood and everybody within the municipality using the term is same yardstick. So I'm using the same process compared to. Now, hypothetically, let's say that there is that one of the neighborhoods, there was an issue. I would go through the same process like I would do with any other variable, make an appropriate adjustment, verify that the adjustment was made, and then I would move on. So the process I'm going to be applying for each and every variable.
Okay.
Okay. I think we may be over our pay grades.
Yes, and I apologize for being a little long-winded, but also in my analysis, I included the costs that would be associated with setting up an assessment system. And currently with $2.54 million that is looking at being allotted would be inadequate to meet the need being raised in H480.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Then I'm going to go on to Edgar Clodfelter, who's with NEMRIC.
I am.
Just for the record, tell us who NEMRIC is.
I am Ed Clodfelter. I'm the senior appraiser for New England Municipal Resource Center. I'm the appraiser guy you're talking about. And I provided some documentation for you to take a look at and go to as detailed levels you want to get into, but I don't think you really want to get that far. I worked at property evaluation for 8 years. I was assistant specialist there back in the early 80s. And then I left and started my own appraisal business for 20 years. At the same time, I worked for a company out of Buffalo, New York, and I taught and worked all over the country and portions of Canada. Salt Lake City, Charleston, South Carolina, Boston, you name it, I was kind of there. So I have sort of that experience as well. I'm currently the senior appraiser for NEMRIC, and I've been with them for about 12 years now. I also happen to be the Vermont rep to IAAO, and I've been a member of IAAO for about 35 years. So I've got a little bit of background and experience from all aspects of this. Like I say, I'm that guy we've been talking about doing reappraisals. I've probably done over 200 reappraisals in the state of Vermont in the last 30 years. And we'll talk a little bit about where we're at today with some of that and answer your question. Now, the first thing I have on this is that I understand that we've changed what came over from the House to what came out of operations from the Senate, and yet the reappraisal portion of that going to the state has sort of been removed from the government ops perspective, and I'm certainly in support of that. I think you've heard from that VALA. I think you've heard from the FTC that they all sort of agree with that, and from Chris as well. The problem came up, the crisis came up because of the CLA triggers, the less than 85% and above 115. And what that's done over the years is allowed towns to delay doing their reappraisals. Like Chris talked about towns that have been delayed for a long time. I finished 2 towns last year. I'm the assessor in the town of Milton, and I also just reappraisal on Milton. It's been 16 years that they had a reappraisal. We finished the town of Fairfax, another 15, 16 years that they completed reappraisal. So that creates sort of a feast or famine situation from a contractor's perspective. 2007, 2008, all of a sudden the market's going up and we're really, really busy. Back with my company, I'm doing 8 reappraisals, a small staff of 4 people. And then 2009 and 10 happened, and all of a sudden there's now towns that are looking for reappraisals. So, it really makes it difficult from my perspective as a contractor, NIMRIC's perspective, or any contractor around that's going to come into Vermont, to have some consistency of staff and do our jobs, look ahead down the road where we're doing stuff. Towns won't reappraise at this point until they've been forced to do it. I had a call from a reporter from the town that just completed a reappraisal. It's about 3 years ago. And it wasn't one that I did. And wanted to know what I thought about the town was in an uproar. The values had gone up 40, 50%. That seemed to be in a crisis. And I said, when was the last reappraisal? He said, 15 years ago. And I said, what do you expect? That's what's going to happen. If you wait that long, you're going to have this big up and down response in terms of what the valuation portion of that's going to be. It's difficult for us as contractors coming into a town that hasn't reappraised for a long time, where we're always going to have to answer that question. How come I went up so much? Because it's just been a long time. And it's incredible that if you go out and do inspections and properties haven't been inspected in 15 years, somehow they change. Something's happened probably with those properties. And so if we more frequently, in terms of how we go about that process, we'll probably pick up a lot of those little things that happen over time frame. And this great delay in doing reappraisals and over a period of year, it really does create a lot of inequity. The new house, you picked up the new house that's going in. People get permits that get permits, they don't always get permits. To put on that new garage, you'll probably pick that up. Other things can happen over time that improvements can be made in the interior properties that we don't pick up. As you've been a realtor, you've seen what happens with all over time. So it does create an inherent bit of inequity. We don't do this on a more consistent basis. So, the first recommendation I have is to get rid of the CLA as a trigger, which I think we're all pretty much in favor of, and go to a more systematic process in terms of doing reappraisals. 16 towns did reappraisals last year. We did 8 of them. So, and then we're working all over the state. 38% of those towns had completed projects for the last 6 years, and 36% have been over 10 years. It's just too long. I think the national standards, is 4 to 6 years in terms of completing projects. Back in my PBR days, 30 years ago, I always felt that a 10-year cycle, and like Chris talked about earlier, and a 5-year update in the middle of all that was a good approach. I'm not sure if that's the answer, but I think it would work for Vermont. I always felt that way. I work in Washington State. We have 2 counties that we work in out there. They do a 6-year inspection cycle. So every year they go out and do 1/6 of the town, and that during the course of each year they look at new tables, new cost tables, new land valuation tables. They update their values every year, depending upon that cycle. Seems to work for them. They don't have this big fluctuation. It's pretty consistent from their perspective. I have a portion of this documentation here about our reappraisal activity. Originally, they were going to implement this process, I think, pretty quickly. And I sort of cautioned the House Ways and Means at that time that right now I've got 40 reappraisal projects scheduled through 2026. So that's how far out we are in terms of doing that. And I provide you a little chart here, and it gives over a 5-year period of the projects that we've done or are going to be doing as well. So that's 58 reappraisal projects from 2022 to 2026. That's about 55,000 properties. I'm asking you to keep that number in mind for when I go to the very end of my discussion. One thing I think we can do, and PBR has known a little bit about this, and a little bit kind of goes to your question earlier, Mr. Brock, is that PBR were to allow towns to do more updates versus full-blown reappraisals. We could probably do more of those quicker. Because when you put boots on the ground, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. It's very expensive to do that. They can be done cheaper, they can be done quicker. But from my perspective, there's a process to go through that. I would never just statistically increase the values by 10%. I just think that's wrong to do. I want to go see what's there for an update from my perspective. But if we could do more of those putting things up a little bit in terms of getting through this cycle, catching up to our reappraisal process. We have to be aware of the size of towns in Vermont. We have a lot of small towns, they are, and we work in a lot of those small towns. You have 48 towns of less than 500 parcels. And there are a lot of them just spread out throughout the whole state. You know, we've done Norton, and we've done Searsburg, and they're all, 125 properties along the way. You can do a bunch of those towns, but we run into a point where the timing restraints in terms of lodging the grand list and then starting the appeals process is so narrow that you can do a number of towns, but when you start to do lodge that grand list and send out notices and start to do hearings, it's a little bit restricted in terms of how many you can do at the same time. It's hard to pull that off. And also affects, I think, in terms of property valuation, in terms of setting the education tax rate. I have a real problem with how we do this right now. And we come along and we're done at the end of June or sometime in July, and then they're required to set that education tax rate in July. And then the towns have had their town meeting in March, and I have no idea what the grand list is going to be. So one of the things nobody's talked about this, we need to move the assessment date to January 1st. I don't know why we haven't done this 30 years ago, to tell you the truth. April 1st was the day that the guys could come down out of the mountains and go back and count the cows. That's why it was April 1st. That's why it was done. I think those days are gone. And so I think it works better for the towns and for the lister if we were to just consider moving that assessment date to January 1st. It solves a lot of problems. If we want to do that.
Yeah, it would, because
most states do that. Most
it
states.
probably has to do with we were under snow up in,
We were.
and you couldn't get out
You
there.
couldn't get out. And we had more snow then.
Yes, we did.
We did.
You were plows.
We did. So that, from my perspective, that's something that's to consider. Right now, we're finished 10 towns. And so I have 4 towns this week that are doing hearings. And just think about the staff that I have to be able to go out and do that. I've got 4 people up in one town, I've got 3 people in another town up here, and I've got 4 people down south working at the town. One of them small, I don't have to worry about it. It takes, to meet this time constraint that we have, it takes staffing to be able to do that and to pull that off. The other thing I have here is, we talked a little bit about listers and what they do and assessors and the education required for that. And the concern I've had with what I've heard from this legislation is that as we require more certifications or restrictions upon who can do this work, we're going to lose our listers. We talked about, a lot of times they feel like they're volunteering their services. They don't get a lot of money for this. A lot of people just want to help their towns out. We need our local listers to do a lot of this work, and for what they know and what they bring to the table. When I was a lister in a town of Calais back in the late 80s, there was a guy named Don Singleton who was the lister. He was retired from the state, probably in his mid-70s. We'd go out on a Saturday morning, we'd drive around back roads, we'd inspecting houses and doing porches and decks. And we're going down the road one day and he stopped. He said, when I was a kid, there was a cabin up top of the hill up there. Let's go see if it's there. We parked the truck, we walked up the side of the mountain, got to the top, and there was that cabin. Now, it was 40 years older. It wasn't in very good shape. But I would have never known. And you can't lose that knowledge that the local listers and assessors have. And I fear that as we push more for them to get higher degrees or specific certification levels, we may lose some of them. They do need education. They got to understand how things work. It's become very complicated in terms of doing our jobs today. A lot of requirements for listers, information that people want to have, how we go about this. The markets are changing. Computer systems are very sophisticated. Now we're going to go to the cloud and go to the web for all this information. It's very, very difficult. It takes a lot of education. I find that they're pretty willing to do that if given the opportunity, and we've given them that opportunity. One of the things that Chris talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of the cost, And this sheet that I gave you really comes from, I put it together because the state was gonna take over the reappraisal process. And I just don't think that they aren't staffed currently, obviously, and what it's gonna take to do that. So when I do a bit of reappraisal project, I go through this process. How many parcels, who's my staff, how many parcels they're gonna do a day, so on and so forth. So I took all 327,483 parcels and put them into my calculations. And if they're gonna do, so you only get about 1,200 days in a 6-year period, because you've got vacations. You can't inspect houses in January, February, I'm sorry. It's cold, there's a lot of snow, you can't get around the house. It's hard to do. So I'm saying, you just keep it. So I'm saying there's 1,200 days in that time frame. That would require 27 inspectors to do that over a 6-year period. And it doesn't count the supervisors, the analysts, the people doing appointments. Doesn't count people who have to deal with appeals. You can count on 3 to 5% appeals over that process as well. That's a lot of 327,000 properties. That's gonna be a lot of appeals to take care of. So it's a pretty big task to think that they were gonna have poor property valuation and review take over this function for this very complex endeavor over a 6-year period. So right now, they're paying their $8.50 a parcel, comes out to $2.783 million a year. We're charging right now about $100 a parcel to do a reappraisal. So taking those out, that's going to be over a 6-year period. It's going to amount to $5.4 million a year to do that process. 5.4 is a lot more than 2.7. I don't know where the money's going to come from for all that process. So I don't think we've really thought about what the costs are going to be to complete this project in that way. So recall that earlier I said we did 55,000 parcels over a 5-year period. And to do a 6-year process would require about 55,000 parcels a year to be completed. We did that over 5 years. So I have a staff of 15 people that work with me. And that's the kind of resources it takes to complete that sort of a process. So we're out to 2026, starting to do contracts for 2027. And I know some of the other contractors, they're all doing 3, 4, 5. They aren't as big as we are. Can't do as many properties, many towns as we can. But of the 5 or 6 of us that are out there doing projects, probably combining some of these smaller jurisdictions together might be an inducement for some of the larger companies to come in and take over some of that work as well. And I think that we'll probably see that happen. But a similar thing happened, by the way, back in the 1980s when there was the property valuation review. So now state firms came in, they come in and tried to do some of that work. They came in, they did their stuff, and they were gone. They didn't stick around. So that's a concern that I have about that as well. So on top of these 40 reappraisals that we're doing, we also are the assessors for and do maintenance work for another 35 towns in the state. That's over 40,000 properties that we deal with. So we're stretched out pretty far. So I guess I'm not sure. I think the 6-year limit will work. I think that's a minimum. I think considering a 10 wouldn't be such a bad idea either. I haven't talked about this with anybody. It's just my thought from 30 years ago, where I had. And back to your question, this year coming up, I'm helping 2 towns do reappraisals. The listers are going to do all the work. In the past, I probably do a town a year. The listers do the work, and I provide the analytical work, the support, and the guidance for them on how to do that. It's work that I really enjoy doing. I think that NEMRC likes to do that as well. NEMRC has always been a company that really supports local government, supports local listers, wants to be a facilitator to them, help them do their work as much as they can. That's where NEMRC comes from, is being supported in towns. Answer any questions you got? Yeah.
This doing a 1/6 of the town every year.
I'm in Washington State.
Okay. Does that, the results in 1 year, the results of that 1/6 of a town, does that become a template for the entire town, or do you just reassess that?
So the physical inspections occur for 160 feet, but every property gets reassessed. They look at the sales, and they develop new cost tables and put them in, and develop new land schedules and put them in if they need them. So they do that study every year. I just talked with one of the counties earlier in the week.
That's what they do for 160.
That's what they do. Well, they do for the whole town. They put new values in for the whole town,
Okay.
whole county in this case. And then they inspect 1/6 of the parcels over the course of 6-year period.
These are all, you do recent sales,
You
right?
do recent
So
sales.
you do sales within the year, that's what realtors did. And then, but you do the inspection. When I did tax appeals, all I saw were average bathrooms.
Yeah.
I'm figuring
Yeah,
below average was an outhouse, and I've yet to, above average must be a spa. But I saw a wide variety, but if they got 3 fixtures and they were,
yeah,
they're
yeah.
average. But you don't know if somebody's put a spa in to what was an average 3 fixture house unless you actually go in there. You don't know if my old avocado appliances have been replaced with stainless steel, and I'm not even sure what the new in thing is.
Avocado will come back.
Yeah, avocado will probably come back. But it's that inspection, because if you add a property, because we did do a tax appeal with the garage burned down 10 years earlier, and it never got picked up. But you need to get in. So there's 2 things. You can do a statistical reappraisal, and that's what you'll pretty much get on Zillow. A 3-bedroom house in this town with this much land is worth. Trust me, my daughter's house is not worth $300,000. But Zillow says it is because that's what, they just do a statistical thing. They don't have to see it.
That's based on sales,
Sales,
not on inspection. The
right?
inspection just refers, what you find in the inspection drives the decision for particular properties.
It does.
that are inspected.
So has that inside been changed? Have they put on that garage? Have they
Right.
taken that deck off? So inspection finds that. But they put in new base values and apply those to everybody in the county.
Yeah, so the 6th of the town, that is not a template for the whole town.
It's not. It's each individual. For example, I worked in Harris County, which happens to be Houston. And what they do in Harris County is they do a model every year for all million properties. A new model every year. And now they also are in appeals 9 months as well. But they do update all the values there every year.
Okay. So along with things we need to make sure are in this study is the cost, staffing, if the state took it over, the value of the present situation, which is having people on the ground who do know. And that moving the date makes some sense. So I think we might want to look at things within the present system, our present scheduling that don't work well with our present property tax scheduling and decision-making.
It's like I told the committee over House Ways and Means, I can fix the CLA numbers in 10 minutes. I can't fix the COD with that. That sort of inequity has to be seen by people. You have to have eyes on the property, pick up the things that are different.
And a statewide person can't do that.
Tough to do, I think.
Yeah,
Why?
not unless well, how many people would it take
27,
to look at,
27 people.
to look at 1/6 of the houses every year? Not to mention the difficulty of getting Vermonters to let you into their house.
I will tell you that's changed a little bit in the past 3-4 years. People aren't quite as welcoming as they have been in the past. It's different than it was 20 years ago. We just will tell you that. And I think justifiably so.
Okay, so maybe Maria will look at, no, Abby, wrong person. Maybe we'll see if we can't just infuse a few things into that study.
There's already a cost
Yes, there's
requirement
cost
for the
in
department to
there.
look, not specifically at changing the the date to lodge the grant list, though. There isn't anything that's specific to that.
Yeah, I think, and I don't even know, have we got a certified appraiser in property valuation?
I'm not sure about the credentials of our district advisors, but I know a lot of them came from that background, so.
So I'll tell you, half of them work for me at one point.
Okay, then that's good to know, because Jill was the committee staff in here.
Would you mind if I added one more comment?
No.
Agreed. I'll just say that, I heard like, some threads throughout these witnesses, which were also support for the removal of the CLA trigger and support from the 6-year cycle. And I just want to remind folks of what Karen said, VLCT and tax came to the House advocating for those two things.
Right.
And it was not our advocacy to be tasked with taking over the whole program. So I think I just want to like have many folks who are watching this like rest assured that our report is going to look at this question very carefully. It's,
Okay.
I don't think it is a foregone conclusion in our minds in any sense that we want to grab that power.
So
And I think
this
that's,
isn't your power grab, it's our loading it on to you.
yes, we appreciate the opportunity to study it, and in doing so, we also want to look at other alternatives of how we can take advantage of predictability and economies of scale without taking over contracting from municipalities. And that's why I think that our attempt to imagine what a reappraisal schedule could look like that also acknowledges the reappraisal work that's going on between now and 2026 and 2027 would be very
I
important.
assume it would help you if you knew, because then you could schedule
I could
your
schedule it, I could.
workload.
I
And
can hire staff in certain areas of the state to work in certain areas, and it can be predictable.
be predictable, and that's always helpful.
If you have questions, I'm just 10 miles up the road.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been always good to talk to the people that do the work. Okay, committee. We're going back to housing, S100. And Maria's here. I told you at the beginning, there were a couple of amendments that came over on the housing bill that had to do with the Public Utility Commission and they didn't sound like anything I thought we would object to, and at this time in the session, I most certainly don't want to take in the housing bill if we don't have to, but my sense is that unless we are prepared to say we don't want it, the secretary will send it to us. Thank you, because there are cases got one from this morning. So Maria, just tell us what's in there.
Sure. Maria Royal with Legislative Council. This is an amendment. It was added S100 yesterday. S100 is up for third reading today. This proposal just generally has to do with utility disconnections, particularly on rental properties, commercial and residential, for the ratepayer. The tenant is the ratepayer. And the concern, the issue that's addressed is ensuring that the landlord has notice if there's disconnection of service to the rental property. So the proposal is basically asking the PUC to revise its existing rules, which covers lots of different aspects of utility disconnections already, but to specifically require that a utility provide notice to the landlord for disconnections. And so this would cover gas, electric, water, and wastewater service, those companies that are subject to PUC jurisdiction. There's another component that was added in House General, and you can see that's on line 12. And ask that the rules also allow a utility to disconnect utility service remotely. There was a concern raised about employees of the electric company having to give that final notice.
on-site. So this was just asking for some discretion to not have to do that, do remotely. So just in terms of what the rules would specifically be asked to kind of look at and balance with respect to the notice. So they'll establish the form, the contract, the time and manner, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom of the page in subdivision 1, subdivision 2, you know, the notification can go to the landlord, or the landlord can designate a property manager or another third party to receive the notice. And then 3, the rules shall ensure, I'm on page 2, that the notification does not include personal or confidential information pertaining to the tenant or the tenant's account.
It's okay, this can print on the back.
Except that the utility may disclose information necessary to enable the property owner or other third party to reconnect utility service to the property. So just not wanting to divulge more information than is necessary, personal information, but allowing the landlord to take proactive steps to reconnect. And then subsection D, as you know, there's some utilities, municipal, water and sewer companies, as well as some private companies that don't qualify, meet the threshold, that are not subject to the PUC's jurisdiction. And so this is just asking the PUC to basically come up with a proposal that incorporates this type of notice requirement for the legislature to consider next year. You would amend Title 24.
So these would be your private water companies that do 20 houses.
Right.
I don't know what the trigger is.
Any municipal,
Any
municipal water or sewer company, and any private water or sewer company. I think for the sewer companies, it's only the smaller ones that are not regulated by the PUC. There's like a threshold.
There are
that comes
neighborhoods
within the-
where there's 5 houses and they have, you know,
Right.
septic system and frequently communal.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Senator McCormick.
This is germane because it pertains not to walls and roof, but it's part of housing. Yeah.
We do a lot of talking about water and sewer. It might not be germane if somebody wanted to challenge it. I don't know, but I think the concern, none of the restrictions go, well, you cannot shut off water, and I'm pretty sure you can't shut off sewer. But the concern is that if you shut off the electricity and the owner owns the refrigerator, or, you know, that there is some impact on the owner's house. And so they should know, they may have property in there. If it's an electric heat and it gets shut off, the pipes could freeze. So it's a recognition that the landlord has a vested interest. They might turn the water or the electricity back on.
Another question is, how many other amendments are coming back with this bill?
I honestly have no idea, because
Okay,
I don't have the draft on this one,
Okay.
Zachary, so I don't
I would
know.
say, given the size of the bill, there's a large number. Would you, Randy? There's a lot of fine,
Well, natural resources got some of those.
yeah, I'm sure you've got the ones. We haven't, this is the one that came in this morning that
But we haven't seen everything.
yeah,
When we passed the bill in the first place, we were
Yes.
told, don't worry, we're only gonna monkey with a little bit of Act 250. And hope,
I don't know.
not a little more.
but,
Wonder if there'll be
this
four
is the
amendments we
one,
get.
and if we don't have an issue with this one, then we won't ask to take it in, or we could, if we have an issue, we could bring an amendment to economic development, but I think we all want to get this bill through.
Yeah, I don't want to hold it up, and I am fine with the first part, notifying owners, but can I just ask about line 12, allowing the utility to disconnect utility service remotely? So is current law that you cannot do that remotely? And I'm just kind of concerned that without any sort of consumer fail-safes, if we're just allowing utilities to remotely shut off electricity or gas, homes, people could be stuck out in remote areas without being able to use their phone because they require electricity for that. So I'm kind of concerned about the dehumanization of that policy. Did they take the testimony?
Well, they heard from a couple of utilities. They heard from the Department of Public Service, Consumer Advocate. And so I'm not that familiar with the practices, but apparently there are a lot of notifications that go out, well, as soon as a payment is missed, for example, or if there's some, what they're communicating about. And I don't know exactly how many, but they said they make every attempt to let them know. There's a lot of communication, and in most instances, the ratepayer pays the bill at the 11th hour, and there is not an actual disconnection. But under the current rules, they are required to go out and give the final notice in person on the property. And the concern was raised by Vermont Electric Co-op that their employees don't always feel safe doing that.
You're out in some pretty remote locations in today's.
Do we want to be able to shut power off to those remote locations remotely?
After 3 notices, maybe. I mean, if nothing's going to change, you're going out and you're giving them a we are turning it off as of 3 o'clock notice. If they call and make arrangements to pay, if they, but you've already had 3 payments, you can call and make arrangements. This is your final notice, and the question is, do you have to deliver that by hand?
Where does it say you have to deliver it by hand?
In the current rule.
It's the current
We're
rule.
changing
Rules, not the law. Is that right? It's the rule, because there's nothing here that says that you can disconnect remotely, but it doesn't say the issue of notice, and that was a question I asked in finance and economic development this morning, is how do you know that people got the notice? Presumably you're sending this stuff by first-class mail. And the answer was, well, we serve them with a notice when we go out to disconnect. Well, if you're disconnecting remotely, what says you have to go out to give them the notice to disconnect in the first place? And is that the intent? I thought the intent was not to do anything like that because for safety issues.
These are centralized services, utilities, so I'm concerned with just the remote nature of this, but it's the end of the session, I don't want to hold it up,
Okay, we can ask the PUC to come in and talk to us tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. You're living at an address, the electricity's at an address, so you should have a valid address.
Well, you should.
You may not.
You should.
But you've gotten 3 notices or 2
I'm on
gotten
the computer here
notices.
this afternoon, and I found that I live in St. Albans town, regardless of where I pay my taxes, according
That's
to the
true.
computer.
Oh, yeah.
And what I'm saying essentially is, what happens when a person doesn't get the notice? Because there's no certified mail return receipt, there's no verification that the notice was actually delivered to the person. And then we said the same thing really applies to the landlord.
Okay, so we will check on that. Then we'll ask the PUC to come in and tell us what their process for disconnection is. I know you cannot shut off the water completely. I'm assuming it would be in no one's best interest to shut off the sewer. I know that there's lifeline services for people on oxygen, that there's a medical thing, that there is a program for them, so it should be known if it's essential, but we'll check on that.
So just to, your point's well taken, that the notices are mailed typically.
Right.
But in terms of the rule requirement about in-hand personal delivery of the final, so when service is disconnected at the premises of the ratepayer, the individual making the disconnection shall immediately inform a responsible adult on the premises that service has been disconnected, or if no responsible adult is then present, such individual shall leave on the premises in a conspicuous and secure place notification advising that service has been disconnected and what the ratepayer has to do to have service restored. So your point's well taken. I'm not saying address that, but this was what the utilities were asking for, a little more flexibility about not having to be there and make that.
Yes, just given the violent nature of some responses we've
So
seen.
if you take this literally allowed to disconnect, they're not gonna be able to do that, to deliver notice. Because the notion of them
That's
delivering a
correct.
notice
Yes.
and then disconnecting remotely simultaneously or whatever, I think just doesn't make sense.
Well, if you read that though, I noticed it said after they disconnect.
After it's been
Well, that's even worse.
disconnected.
So, but I mean, that's when they give notice
Yeah.
now. He goes out, he throws the switch out in the
Right.
street.
Yeah.
And you get charged with a reconnection notice. They don't have to throw that switch on the street. They can
Sure.
throw it in the office. But you're there, you've cut off the electricity, and you now have a very irate citizen. There is an increased risk to the health and welfare of the person that didn't make that decision and is just doing their job. And I guess it's that balance, yeah.
Utilities get a lot, I mean, they have a monopoly in certain areas and they're getting charged to build up their services, so I almost think they should take on that risk and have that human check.
It will get reflected in your bill. Washington Electric requested this, I think that's what you just said.
Well,
We heard from them.
In Test General, Vermont Electric, Andrea Cohen, and Washington Electric both testified, Lewis Porter. And they both spoke. I think Andrea was actually the one who raised this issue, and Lewis supported it.
Okay, so maybe we should see if Andrea can come in and I'd see if Washington Electric can. And the PUC tomorrow, and we'll see if we can figure this out. The testimony this morning though is the vast majority, once you get a notice that it is about to be shut off, pay. And last year, Senator Chipman, you weren't here, but we had the arrearages program during COVID, and the utilities came in and said, look, nobody's signing up for that because we also had programs that you couldn't disconnect their utilities. And twice, as I remember, we had to remove that no disconnect policy so that people you're about to get disconnected before they made the effort to sign up for the program that paid their electric bills. And the utilities were still getting stuck with the cost of providing the electricity. So I doubt that you've got very many.
And that was part of what was discussed. That's why initially in the initial draft, it said shall provide notice that service is going to be disconnected. The utility said, we send lots of notices and most of the time they ultimately pay. If we have to start sending notices to the that we prefer that notice go out immediately after the disconnection because that limits substantially the number of ratepayers.
I'm sure that we're gonna see that situation in January. in which some family gets disconnected and swears they have never received a notice of any
Oh, yeah.
kind because the mailing address was wrong or.
And they're on
whatever.
oxygen and dying from
Yeah,
cancer.
exactly.
Fights for each
Yes,
other.
and that's the thing that nobody wants to see happen. But
And
I
just can I-
think there is a
There
way.
is a winter disconnection.
Oh, yeah,
No
that's right.
gas or electric utility may disconnect service to any residential ratepayer between November 1st and March 31st.
First cold day in April.
Remotely or otherwise.
Or otherwise. There
That's
is,
the neat thing.
however, there are conditions, I just haven't been able to read it quickly enough. And this is saying,
This language doesn't override that.
no. And this would require the utility to make reasonable attempts to give the ratepayer actual oral notice.
So that's a phone call,
So that would be a phone call. I'm just not familiar enough with how they.
Okay, so we'll ask
Only
them.
nothing burger.
Okay, we'll continue this tomorrow. You have 6 whole minutes before we go to S94. We'll take a 5-minute break, which means we'll be back here in 10.
Julie, this,
Back by.
Cold minutes.